The popular mini wood lathe is a nice little machine for wood turning in a limited space. I needed a stand for mine, and my requirements were that the stand be compact, stable and rigid, simple to build, and mobile, so that I could move it around the shop or even take it outside during good weather. As a bonus, this stand lends itself to accepting easily made add-ons for dust collection and for storing accessories. I used standard construction lumber that was left over or salvaged from other projects. For the sake of clarity, here are the terms I used to identify the various parts of the stand. Here is the materials list and dimensions for the basic stand. The stand is no longer than the lathe itself, so be sure your lathe will fit and make any adjustments as necessary. You may want to vary the height of the stand to suit your personal taste. Construction of the stand is straightforward, but for strength and rigidity, be sure that all joints are snug-fitting with good contact between the glued surfaces and properly clamped up when being assembled. I began by cutting the pieces to length. Then I laid out the lap joints connecting the legs to the feet. I used a dado head on a radial arm saw to cut the dados in the feet, but you can use whatever tool is available to you. This was also a good time for me to drill the holes for the caster stems on the underside of the feet. Next, I cut the mating half of the lap joint in the ends of the legs. After that, I turned the legs around and cut the notches that will accept the top rails. At this point, I did a test assembly without glue just to make sure the pieces would go together correctly. As a precaution, I labeled the mating lap joints so that I wouldn't do anything embarrassing like gluing up the legs backwards with the rail notches facing inwards instead of outwards. It's a good idea to soften any sharp edges. Now it was time to glue up the legs to the feet and let the assemblies dry. When that was done, the top rails were glued to the legs. I had already installed the casters on the feet, but this could also be done later. Notice the use of a temporary spacer block between the legs so that the clamps would not force the legs out of parallel. This assembly is a little awkward to handle while the clamps are being put into place, and it is also necessary, when the clamps are tightened, to use a rafter square to ensure that the legs are accurately perpendicular to the top rails. After the glue was cured on this whole affair, it was time to install the lower rail. Keeping the assembly upside down, I used some scrap pieces to keep the lower rail in its proper position while I checked the fit. We all make mistakes, and I spaced the legs a little too far apart so that the lower rail did not fit snugly between the legs, which showed a gap. So I just cut a thin piece to act as a filler and glued one on each end of the rail. After correcting that little mistake, I then glued the lower rail to both the front and back legs. Now that I had a snug fit, I used another scrap piece to slightly spread the legs open so that I could easily slip the rail in place. With the rail in final position, the temporary spreaders were removed and the clamps applied. This completed the basic stand. After the glue was dry, it was time to place the lathe on the stand and have a look. Everything looked good, except that the lathe could not be secured to the stand with the lathe's standard leveling feet. I removed these and screwed the lathe to the stand using a wood screw and a rubber foot or bumper under each corner. The lower rail I used was pretty ugly, so I painted it black, but more importantly, I added a chisel and accessory rack to it. To make sure the chisels wouldn't slide out when the lathe was moved around, I made sure the chisels would be captured with a taper approximated by 2 holes of slightly different sizes. The rack was attached to the rail with a few wood screws. Now it was looking pretty nice, but there was still room for improvement. I added a piece of 1/2 inch plywood as a chip deflector to shuttle some of the dust and chips to the rear of the lathe. Next, I added a second accessory storage rack to the inside back rail. Good lighting is essential, so I installed a lamp onto the rear. An inexpensive plastic toilet mounting flange I picked up at the hardware store fits perfectly onto the hose of my dust collector and is mounted on a simple block that slides along the front rail. It captures some of the chips, but more importantly, most of the dust. Of course, the stand may be customized in many different ways. Just use your imagination. Thanks for watching. Work safely and happy turning.